When I was about 9 or 10, my parents wanted to buy me a bicycle, and one of the kids at the school had one for sale. So I went over, and they looked at me and said, "Oh, you're Jewish." And I said, "Yes." "Oh, well, we don't take money from Jews. It's dirty money."
I got a job as a tour guide doing walking tours around downtown Toronto. And for part of that, I had to kind of research a lot of Toronto's history. While I was doing that, what really stuck out to me was a lot of the Jewish history in Toronto, because I'd grown up in the community. I'd heard, the grandparent stories, the great aunts, the family friends, and what have you. But it was really something else, like researching it from a historical perspective. There's no more defining moment in Toronto Jewish community history, I think, than the riots at Christie Pitts. And while I was doing the research, I kind of realized I'd always thought that it had just been this isolated incident of these gangs that kind of just clashed and went their separate ways at the end of the day. But I realized the more I researched it that this was a incident that had a lot of context to it, a lot of background, a lot of build-up.
Toronto is one of the great multicultural cities of the world. I believe the latest statistic shows that a majority of people that live in Toronto weren't born here, or weren't born in Canada. And that really says something about the character of the city. Back in the 1930s, you're talking about a very different kind of place. The two large minority groups in the city, relatively speaking, were Jews that constituted something more than 7% of the population, and Italians at about 3% of the population, and then all the others were much smaller than that, making up the last 10%. So it was quite a straight-laced place. It was sometimes called the Belfast of Canada, partly because of the predominance of the Orange Order at that time. It was very difficult to get a city job if you weren't a member of the Orange Order, and that automatically excluded Catholics, Italians were Catholics, and Jews.
Some of the other kids, because of my last name, Forer, they called me foreigner. This was before the war, when people that were immigrants stood out. The overall attitude is that you were different, really, and you could not become one of them because you weren't born one of them. So there was always this attitude that you quite didn't fit in.
Reading through all the Toronto papers from January 33 to the end of the riot in August, that the Toronto papers were filled with events as to what was going on in Germany, and not buried in the back pages, but on the front pages. They all prominently featured the swastika, and it was very clear to anyone who ever read a paper in Toronto or who listened to the news. The swastika became intimately associated with the Nazi movement.
This was an extremely Protestant area of the city, in fact the most Protestant area, and they're very concerned about outsiders coming into their community. There's certain groups that had created swastika clubs, and they started popping up all around different areas. So there's one in the Balmy Beach area, there's one in Q Beach area. And so what they'd do is they'd sell these pins to put on your bathing suits, and people would be walking around, these young people kind of patrolling them, starting little scuffles here and there, and trying to make sure that these people felt unwelcome in this area. As this was coming to a headway, a big part of this was that the Jewish people started to push back. They realized that this was anti-Semitism and that they weren't being welcomed, and they didn't want to have any of it. And so when the beach club just down the road started flying swastika banners and flying a swastika flag, they held a dance there one night, and a bunch of the Jewish boys from the Spadina neighborhood came down here and wanted to kind of start a ruckus and to show that they weren't going to be pushed around. Eventually the police came in and they busted up the dance before any big altercations happened, but there was tensions there, and you could tell that the city was pretty much on edge.
Christie Pitts was situated in a kind of auspicious piece of territory or geography of the city. It was kind of on the border between the area south of Bloor Street, where there was a large number of Jews and Italians. North of Christie Pitts, it was very clearly, predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So it was, in a sense, natural that if there was going to be trouble between these various communities, that Christie Pitts would be a kind of natural location for the outbreak of hostilities, which it was. At the time in question, there was a semi-final baseball series for the championship, softball championship of the city, between two teams, one associated with St. Peter's Church, Bloor and Bathurst, and the other from Harvard Playground. And it was at the opening series of three. One member of the pit gang who had emblazoned a white swastika on his black shirt raised it and waved it around, and that caused some trouble, some fisticuffs and so on at the end of that first game. But nothing major had occurred.
The pit gang, after they couldn't find a fight after unveiling the swastika flag, they came back later that night and they painted a Heil Hitler on the clubhouse grounds. At the actual day of the game, there's a lot of tension in the air. 10,000 people came. Everyone knew that something was about to go down, but there was a very minimal police presence. Almost right away, there were Heil Hitler salutes and chants and small little fights going on. There'd be boys kind of taking their bicycles, going down to college in Spadina and rounding up as many people as they could find to come up and fight. And a lot of these people would just grab whatever they had in their houses. So lead pipes, pool cues, baseball bats, rocks, whatever have you, they brought and came ready to fight. So reporting afterwards had mentioned that maybe about 10,000 people had taken part in the riot, but the more accurate number was probably around 2,000 to 3,000 people, which is still an insane amount for this small neighborhood that had never seen anything like it before. I mean, people were getting pulled in off the street that had nothing to do with it. They just ended up in the middle of all of this giant riot. The riot ends up lasting for about 6 hours. In the last 2 hours, it really dies down and the police are able to regain control and send everyone home. But there's still people lingering around ready to fight up until about 2 a.m. in the morning.
I never complain about anything today. I feel like I'm one of the other Canadians that happen to come from other countries, although I was born right here, which is a big advantage. And my life here is very satisfactory. And now that I'm back here for the last 5 years, very happy here and have a good family around me. And I certainly don't feel threatened or intimidated or out of place for any reason.